Hey y'all, it's me Sydney and welcome back to Planet Sid. So today we are going to be discussing the infantilization of femininity. So if you guys are interested in that, then stay tuned. And also, before we get into the video, I just want to thank you guys so much. I see that I have 167 subscribers, so I really just want to thank you guys for choosing to join this community and to watch my channel and my journey grow. I'm so grateful. And also, I do know that it has been a while. I was going through some stuff. It doesn't really matter. I don't think you guys really care. But yeah, we're gonna be back. I'm gonna be back with consistent uploads starting now, and I guess you guys will just see. But anyways, let's get into the video. So it is officially November, which means that Halloween just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. So if you're like me, then you were really excited for Halloween and everything. You probably went to go look at Halloween costumes and stumbled upon the endless aisles of schoolgirl Halloween costumes and other infantilizing, odd but normalized costume ideas that have been around for years. And these types of costumes aren't anything new. Like, they've been around for years, obviously, but then I started to wonder, why is it so normalized to over-sexualize girls and infantilize adult women? And also why it's okay to capitalize off of that as well. But the more I began to marinate and wonder on this question, I began to discover that it's literally everywhere. And I also want to do a quick disclaimer that I'll be discussing infantilization in reference to femininity and how it perpetuates misogyny. But I do want to make it clear that infantilization and gender roles aren't exclusive to heterosexual cisgendered couples, and they can literally be seen anywhere. It's just a lot easier to spot, and that's where most of the research is done on the topic that I'm doing today. So I did just want to put that out there. So I guess the first question before we get into the nitty-gritty is that I want to define what infantilization is. So Google will define the term infantilize as when you treat someone as a child or in a way which denies their maturity in age or experience. So throughout this video, we're going to be discussing infantilization in reference to femininity, gender roles, sex, and aesthetics. Because now in mainstream media, especially if you're active on Twitter or Instagram or even on YouTube and especially TikTok, you don't really even have to look too far to see a woman being infantilized or an underage girl being over-sexualized. And that can be seen literally everywhere, whether it be in a magazine to where a woman is trying to sell something in a spread and she's dressed in a sexy manner, but she's holding a teddy bear or something like that. Or just recently, if you were scrolling on Amazon looking for a Halloween costume and you just happen to be searching for women's Halloween costumes, I'm pretty sure that one of the first ones that popped up in the search engine would have been schoolgirl costumes, which is obviously pretty popular and they've been around for as long as I've been alive. But that's kind of odd. And it doesn't just stop there. You could be watching your favorite classic movie and the main character is a barely legal or underage girl who is being sexually pursued by a much older man. So infantilization is literally everywhere, and it kind of permeates into a lot of different industries in different ways that I don't think a lot of people have questioned, which is fine because it's very normalized. But I do want to point out that there is a very clear line between a girl, an underage girl, and an adult woman, but it seems that the world is obsessed with blurring that line for whatever reason. It seems that today, now more than ever, we equate sexiness with cuteness, and that could be through aesthetics, beauty, behavior, and gender roles. So let's get into it. So the image of an infantilized woman or an over-sexualized girl is nothing new. You can see it literally on your For You page, on a billboard, or in magazines. But then I began to wonder, where did these ideas originate? I did stumble upon a book by Charles Darwin in 1871. It's called The Descent of Men. And he really kicked off the war against body hair, which is just one of the small ways that women can be infantilized. So in the book, Charles Darwin equated a woman having body hair to being insane, unfeminine, unkempt, and dirty, who resembled the looks of the quote-unquote inferior race. So this idea of body hair being unfeminine and unkempt in comparison to being hairless is obviously rooted in infantilization. Growing body hair as a human is a sign of maturity. Obviously, when we are young kids, before we hit puberty, we don't have body hair in certain places. So once you do get older and you hit puberty, that's a sign of maturity that you're getting older. And that is very much embraced in men. Obviously, everybody's excited for a man to get their beard or for them to grow in their mustache or get chest hair or whatever. But with women, when they start to grow hair on their legs or in their private area, or just on their face or anywhere, it's a very different attitude. And so women are told from a very young age that this hair that they're growing on their body, whether it be under their arms or wherever, that is a sign of unfemininity and that it signals that they are unkempt. Then that's technically saying like this prepubescent look is what women should aim for, which is wild, just saying that out loud. Of course, infantilization doesn't stop at body hair. You can see it in Korean and Western beauty standards and the industry of anti-aging skincare. But then I started to think more on why does the world, and more specifically men, equate femininity with cuteness. It's like they want women to have this almost childlike aesthetic while being still sexually desirable. Later in the video, we're going to touch on how infantilization and gender roles can be seen and manifest in behaviors, but first we are going to focus on the physical aspects. But before I get into this, I do want to make it clear that I am obviously very young. I'm 23 years old. Obviously, I'm not faced as of yet with the societal consequences of what it means to age as a woman, as far as getting older and having wrinkles and all that stuff. And I also do completely understand beauty standards and the pressure one may feel to assimilate, because for women especially, there's a very high price that you have to pay if you aren't deemed as beautiful. So I don't want to shame anybody if they have, did cosmetic procedures. And I also understand, like, on a different perspective, how one might feel inclined to slow down their age, because it can be as a sign of getting closer to death, which somebody may want to avoid. The conversation surrounding aging, especially with women, is a very layered, complex one. But just for the sake of this video, I just want to make it clear that I'm not shaming anyone, and I just want to focus on infantilization through the beauty industry. So I want to discuss how our obsession with beauty standards, anti-aging, and body hair is partially rooted in infantilization. And I say this because if you look closely at current beauty standards, then they seem to rely heavily on mixing childish and adult-like aesthetics. That could be whether how you dress or cosmetic procedures or your behavior, but why? And I do know, like, on a more scientific level, like, they're having studies to where obviously people, when they see something cute, whether that be like a small animal or a baby, for example, associated with beauty, but they also associate that cuteness with innocence. And they associate it with innocence in reference to feeling the need to protect and nurture whatever they're looking at. So I did see an article for the Pacific Standard, and the editor, Lisa Wade, goes on to explore why the world only celebrates women who are cute and sexy. And she says that, quote, "The sexualization of girls and the infantilization of adult women are two sides of the same coin. They both tell us that we should find youth and experience and naivete sexy in women, but not in men. This reinforces a power and status difference between men and women, where vulnerability, weakness, and dependency and their opposites are gender traits desirable in one sex but not the other." And she also argues that a guy interprets this trend as the, quote, "result of a cultural imperative for women to embody both the cute and sexual," unquote. So women don cute clothes with colorful patterns associated with children and wear flippy skirts and baby doll t-shirts. They wear eyeliner to give the illusion of the large eyes of childhood, foundation to hide the marks of aging on their face, and pink on their cheeks to mimic the blush of youth. They are taught these imperatives from an early age, unquote. Which is nothing wrong if you want to wear blush or highlighter or eyeliner, for example, because I'm going to continue to wear it, and you should wear mine for box office beauty. But anyways, I find it so crazy that even in our normal everyday makeup routines, if you do wear makeup, then we're putting on eyeliner, and we may not even realize it, because I don't. I just put it on because that's just how, like, I'm supposed to do my makeup or whatever. But when that first came about, when women first started wearing blush on their cheeks and putting eyeliner on their eyes, it was with the intention to infantilize themselves. And I think what's so sad about infantilization is that it's become so normalized that we are so desensitized, because there is a whole sector of the beauty industry and skincare that is dedicated to anti-aging. And of course, wearing makeup doesn't mean that you want to look older or younger. I do think that it's interesting that most of the makeup trends that have stood the test of time and have stuck around for ages are rooted in infantilization. Or even something like contouring your nose and highlighting it. Like, of course, that's also partially rooted in anti-blackness as well, but I wonder if it's rooted in infantilization, like subconsciously have smaller features so they can be considered cuter. But that's just me speculating, and I think it's just something interesting to think about. But to dig deeper into our obsession with aging as women, Susan Sontag wrote a really deep, good essay on the double standard of aging. So in this essay, she says, quote, "Once past youth, women are condemned to inventing and maintaining themselves against the inroads of age. Most of the physical qualities regarded as attractive in women deteriorate in life than those defined as male." And then she goes on to say that, quote, "The feminine is smooth, rounded, hairless, unlined, soft, unmuscled. The look of the very young, characteristics of the weak, of the vulnerable, late adolescence and early 20s is when this look is physiologically natural, in which it can be had without touching up and covering up. After that, women enlist on a quixotic enterprise, trying to close the gap between the imagery put forth by society concerning what is attractive in a woman and the evolving facts of nature." And it's so crazy because for most women, unless you're like Angela Bassett or something, those young, youthful looks, like in the grand scheme of things, we only have those for a very short period of time. And it's not like you look like shit after, but your beauty just changes over time. So in 10 years, I don't think I'll look like this. I mean, who knows? But in 25 years, I know for sure I won't look like this. Like, I'm obviously going to have signs that I've aged. It's so crazy because a lot of times when women see themselves starting to age, then they feel pressure to conform and to preserve and maintain their youth by having things like anti-aging skincare, eye creams, Botox, and other things like that. And I can't say that I blame them, because obviously, again, like, there's a huge price that you can pay for not being deemed as beautiful and desirable in our society, especially in Western American society. But then again, it just makes you wonder, like, why are the aesthetics of girlhood sexy? There's something really twisted and odd about finding a woman sexy because she resembles a young girl. And I don't want to put the blame on women, because infantilization is obviously a byproduct of the male gaze. And so obviously we've all been socialized to view ourselves that way, and we're always perceived that way by the opposite sex as well. So it's kind of inevitable to in some way feel forced to assimilate. And furthermore, obviously women have been told since the beginning of time that they should aspire to be married and to be mothers. So if you're being told your entire life that in order to attain that, then you should be youthful and behave like a young lady and be docile and submissive, and you've been socialized to believe that that's what you want out of life, it's very easy to not question that and then to just fall into that trap. This can be applied to all women because, in my opinion, gender roles aren't just reserved for heterosexual couples. Obviously, they're easier to spot, but they can exist in any partnership, whether they're the same sex or not. But back to the conversation about beauty, Susan believes that, quote, "Women's business in this society, it's the theater of their enslavement. Only one standard of beauty is sanctioned, the girl. The greatest advantage that men has is that our culture allows two standards of male beauty, the boy and the man. The beauty of a boy resembles the beauty of a girl. In both sexes, it is fragile kind of beauty and flourishes only in the early art of the life cycle. Happily, men are able to accept themselves under another standard of good looks, heavier, rougher, and more thickly built. A man does not grieve when he loses the smooth, unlined, hairless skin of a boy, for he has exchanged one form of attractiveness for another. The darker skin of a man's face, roughened by daily shaving, showing the marks of emotion, the normal lines of age. There is no equivalent of this second standard for women. The single standard of beauty for women dictates that they must go on having clear skin. Every wrinkle, every line, every gray hair is a defeat. No wonder why no boy minds becoming a man, while even the passage from girlhood to early womanhood is experienced by many women as their downfall. For all women are trained to want to continue looking like girls. This is not to say that there are no beautiful women, but the standard of beauty in any woman of any age is how far she retains or manages to simulate the appearance of youth, unquote. As I was reading this, the people that literally popped in my head was somebody like Beyonce or like Jennifer Aniston or Angela Bassett, because obviously, I don't know, like Jennifer Aniston is like the white women to white women, and obviously Beyonce is Beyonce, and Angela Bassett is Angela Bassett, and these are all talented women, very successful. But anytime, like, let's say Beyonce were to post a picture right now, there's going to be somebody in the comments saying like, oh, 40 wear, or the same thing if Angela Bassett, like whenever she has like a bikini picture or something, and then they'll say like, wow, Angela Bassett like ages in reverse, or she doesn't age at all. And it's like, obviously it's a compliment, you know, like I don't think too much into it, but it's crazy that we congratulate women and that it's so normalized to congratulate women on their ability to attain their youth. Even when Lori Harvey, when she lost all that weight, then everybody started doing Pilates, like Pilates haven't been around forever, or like on TikTok when they were obsessed with Jennifer Aniston's salad, which she didn't even eat. These are both obviously beautiful women, but a part of their beauty is the fact that they retain some form of youthfulness, and that their perception, and that the world perceives them as aging slowly or not aging at all. And this is exactly what Susan was talking about. It's so normalized to congratulate women on their ability to defy the odds of aging. Whereas with men, society uses terms like silver fox or dad bod to describe men as a compliment who are aging. There isn't really a cause for men who are aging opposed to women. And it's just painfully obvious that the aesthetic of femininity that is so deeply rooted in infantilization doesn't really include real women. And what I mean by real women is obviously women who have wrinkles, who don't get Botox and plastic surgery every day, because I mean, plastic surgery is a very normal thing now, but there are still a lot of women who are 100% natural, and women who have stretch marks and uneven skin tones. Like, this standard of beauty and what women are told that they should aim for is such a ultra refined version of a over sexualized girl. And I want to briefly cover women's Halloween costumes and lingerie, because just looking at the packaging and the terminology that these companies use when describing these costumes and lingerie, it's a very interesting experience. So for starters, if you look at lingerie or costumes, you'll see the typical selection of the sexy bunny, the schoolgirl, the police officer, and then just whatever else is trending for that year. Whereas in contrast, typically men are expected to dress in costumes that exude power. Now, of course, there are unlimited options for what you want to dress up as for Halloween, but there is an imbalance on how much costumes for women are over sexualized and infantilized in comparison to men's costumes. And so I did see a research where Lori Hires and Erin Hipple concluded that, quote, nearly a third of girls' costumes and more than 90% of women's costumes had some sexualization, she said. Meanwhile, less than 1% of boys' costumes and only 11% of men costumes had the same. And if you think about it, that statistic obviously isn't too surprising just looking at the aisles of Halloween selections that we have. Since Halloween is a very big holiday commercially, and there's so much to profit off of, gender marketing is a very real thing, and it's obviously easier to spot nowadays. But it's not far-fetched to see how women's costumes reflect how society views their bodies. And I want to point out that these outdated ideas surrounding gender roles are marketed to children at very young ages. And these small differences in something as trivial as a Halloween costume could be planting seeds that will influence how they view their gender and how they view the opposite sex later in their lives. And so I do think that one way to counteract this would be by not marketing Halloween costumes to specific genders at all, no matter what age. And the packaging of these costumes don't help at all, because it'll feature a model on the front posing in a childlike manner, wearing frilly socks, posing in a classroom, and wearing pigtails, for example. And then they'll use language like the naughty schoolgirl, or the sexy Playboy bunny, which is so wild. These were things that represented innocence and adolescence. So it's so wild that one day somebody was like, I want to equate this with sexiness, and the rest of the world was just like, okay. And what's so frustrating about the normalization of over-sexualization and infantilization is that it perpetuates this idea that women have to perfectly straddle this line of being this super sexy siren while also having this air of innocence and purity. But furthermore, I was reading an article with The Refinery 29, and editor Electra Weedman, when describing her experience with going lingerie shopping, wrote that, quote, "The second wave of disillusionment came with a twinge of shame. In several online stores, I had to click under the naughty menu to find anything that wasn't super basic, cotton panty and a bra. Anything that's not virginal or functional gets placed in the, quote, mildly rude or indecent category." And yes, I understand that the word naughty can be applied playfully, but it felt insulting to me. Just because I have sex and want to attract sex, in this case with my long-term boyfriend, does that make me, quote unquote, naughty? There was also a lot of baby doll stuff, which just felt infantilizing. And then she went on to say that, quote, "Now, I know that a lot of people would argue that the baby lingerie versus naughty archetypes are reflective of many men's fantasies about women, the whole Madonna whore complex. But I ask you, isn't there room for something that's a little more all-encompassing? And isn't perpetuating these types of sexual stereotypes problematic in keeping women stuck in dualistic roles? Not to mention maybe making it hard for men to understand what women are really like. And can't women want to embrace their sexuality and sexual powers without it being considered anything but perfectly natural and not naughty?" Generally, I feel that no matter how carefully I tread the sex arena, I am either too little or too much, never on the mark. A feeling that many women share in other facets of their lives, end quote. And I thought that this was such an interesting perspective that she spoke about, because there have always been tiny seeds of shame that have been planted in women's subconscious minds for literally their entire lives through the language that people use to describe women's sexuality, and there isn't really anything that deviates outside of that. And so honestly, I have to challenge myself and think of different ways that I've internalized that. And then I also had to unlearn that there was nothing wrong with a woman being either overtly sexual or modest. And I also find this article interesting because the person who wrote this was a straight woman, and I identify as a lesbian, but it also reminded me that I am still, to a degree, still surveilling myself under the male gaze and how other men would view me as I navigate the world. So I guess now I'm trying to challenge myself for that to not be the standard for what I believe to be feminine and beautiful and sexy for myself. But back to the topic of language. A lot of the times the language that people use to describe women who are being overtly sexual is very infantilizing. And so this could be words on the package of your Halloween costume, which a sexual partner says to you if you're having a romantic encounter, or even language that we see in the media when they are describing women who are overtly sexual. And so, for example, obviously we see things like naughty, whether that be if you're looking for a lingerie costume or if that's on the package of your costume. They make it seem like there's something wrong or shameful about a woman wanting to be overtly sexual, or this idea of being naughty and deserving of being scolded for wanting to have sex. Or even to take it further, how in some heterosexual relationships where one partner may be more feminine presenting and the other partner may be more masculine presenting, there's this thing where the feminine presenting one will call the masculine presenting one daddy, or how the masculine one will refer to the feminine one as good girl. And those are very normalized ways in how people in romantic partnerships communicate with one another, which I don't think it's anything wrong with it, but I do think it's interesting how things like daddy and good girl are more socially acceptable, whereas if a man were to call a woman mommy, that is like an instant turn off, like universally, unless that's like a specific kink of yours. Now, I do understand that people have kinks, so I don't want to shame anybody, because obviously that's not my job. As long as you guys are two consenting adults, I don't really care. So I don't want to shame anyone, because I understand that humans are very complex beings, so it would be a huge assumption to say that if you do prefer your sexual partner who you're in a consensual legal relationship to exhibit certain behaviors, then that is enough evidence to make an assumption about your character. I think that would be a very slippery slope. So I do just want to put that out there, like, kinks are a thing. So if you are consenting and a legal adult, who am I to judge? But I do think that some kinks should be questioned though. But that's all I'm going to say. So now, since we're talking about the infantilizing ways that people can use language surrounding women's sexuality, I want to explore the tones that women can sometimes adopt that can in a way be infantilizing as well. And what I mean by tone is like literally your intonation, especially when women are speaking to the opposite sex. And as I was researching for this video, I came across the phenomenon that is the quote-unquote sexy baby voice, and that is described as the tone and voice that women adopt whenever they're speaking to a romantic interest or whenever they're speaking to someone in a position of power. Because I do know for sure, if I'm calling in for a job, I most certainly do change my voice. I don't think I do it in romantic settings, but I know for sure I intentionally change my voice whenever I'm calling in for a job, because, you know, you got to use that racial bias to your advantage. You know, it's hard out here. But I did see a study as I was researching for this video on a research that was done in 2013 that focused on human vocal attraction and that being a signal of body size. And they found that, quote, the results presented here show that female voices rated as more attractive were breathy, high-pitched, not too high though, with widely dispersed formants, again, not too dispersed. And all these qualities are consistent with the projection of a relatively small body size. In contrast, male voices rated as more attractive were low-pitched with densely distributed formants, both of which project a large body size. The male voice attractiveness also increased with breathiness, which projects a small body size. These results are largely consistent with the hypothesis that vocal attractiveness is achieved with the size projection mechanism also used in animal calls. But the breathiness in the male voice attractiveness rating is intriguing, as it could be a way of neutralizing the aggressiveness associated with a large body size. These results were taken together with the dimorphism between female and male vocal anatomy, and it suggests that what makes the voice attractive are mostly properties that enhance characteristics that are already in the average voice of the sex: high-pitched, dispersed formants and breathiness in female voice, and low-pitched and long vocal tract in the male voice. These findings may therefore explain why average voices are more attractive than certain individual voices. That is, the continual reproductive success of the human species means that the average individual attributes, including those of the voice, must have been sufficiently attractive to the opposite sex. But for any individual to stand a better than average chance, it would be desirable to exaggerate the characteristics that further enhance attractiveness, and the enhancement based on the present findings seems to be based on the principle of body size projection in the case of the voice. And I wasn't really too surprised by their findings, because obviously I think all women have done it at one point in their lives where they're talking to someone in a romantic setting, and you know, if you're just trying to impress somebody, and if you're trying to, you know, just talk to somebody who you're interested in, you're going to naturally raise your voice. Because subconsciously, I guess, like, because I'm not even, if I do that in a romantic setting, especially if I was younger, I don't think I did it consciously, but I know a lot of women subconsciously, they raise and higher the pitch of their voices whenever they're talking to somebody of romantic interest, especially if they're heterosexual. But I did find it interesting that, I guess on a more scientific level, that the reason why people change the tone of their voices when talking to someone in a romantic sense could be due to a body size projection, because women, if they're raising their voices, or a naturally higher voice is associated with a smaller body size, whereas a lower voice is associated with a bigger body size. So of course that whole phenomenon of the body size projection in and of itself is fat phobic, because I completely believe it. Like, I also thought about how crazy the level of mental gymnastics that women usually do on a daily basis throughout the multiple interactions that a woman would just have in her everyday life. And so it's like we're doing all these mental gymnastics so that we can climb this beauty ladder and hierarchy that is based solely on how we are perceived. Because being perceived as attractive, whether it's rooted in infantilization or not, does have its perks, because obviously desirability is a very real thing. And so I just wonder how it feels to navigate the world, to be completely liberated from that. But I wonder if it's even possible, because even though these are things that I'm becoming more aware of as I get older and just as I continue to explore and gain knowledge on certain ideas, I know that there are still things that I do on a subconscious level that I might not be aware of, like now, or maybe in 20 years, or maybe I won't ever be aware of. Like, who knows? It's just crazy, because I would have never even thought to question, why do I raise my tone or raise my pitch in my voice? Because to some extent, I've always been aware of myself and the fact that I am always being perceived as a Black woman, and also, I guess, depending on if your gaydar is on or not, a Black queer woman. And so I'm aware that everything that I say, and so I'm aware on my end, like everything that I say is going through all those filters. Like, you're receiving me as a woman, you're also receiving me as a Black woman, and you're also receiving me as a Black queer woman. So the amount of mental gymnastics that I do on my end, because I'm aware of how I'm being perceived, is crazy. And I know that a lot of other women, it doesn't really matter what intersecting identities you have, like that's something that all women can relate to, like that hyper awareness of your existence and the fact that you're always perceiving and observing yourself. And of course, I think that everyone should actively work to question if their actions are rooted in infantilization, and to decenter the white male gaze from how they view themselves, and choose to show up in the world as their most authentic selves, whatever that may look like. But then it's just like, well, dang, like I could call in on an application and not get a job because my pitch didn't sound a certain way. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, dang, like, will there ever be a way to navigate the world like completely liberated without it being such a cost? Who knows? But back to the conversation surrounding the quote-unquote sexy baby voice. In an article with Days, the editor Britt Dawson said that, quote, according to a 1998 study, women's voices have actually deepened over time, reflecting their rise to more prominent roles in society. Although this may help with women exceeding in the workplace, it probably won't make them especially likable or sexually appealing. While lower voices and other assertive behavior in general effectively signal and assert power and authority in women, as it does in men, Joy Chang, a social psychologist at York University, told the BBC, quote, it might also have the unintended effect of undermining how well liked they are. Women intuitively know how to use a low pitch in work meetings and a high pitch when flirting. But it is contrary to a 2002 study which found that when women were asked to make their voices sound attractive, they mostly lowered their pitch and made their voices more quote-unquote breathy. So they go on to explain that there is a chance of what people consciously perceive as sexy and how they behave when told to sound attractive is different than what they actually do unconsciously, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And that article about the sexy baby voice was actually written about a contestant on the Netflix show Love is Blind, and she was on the first season, I believe, in 2020. I don't watch the show, so I don't really know much about her. I did see a clip though, but her name was Jessica, and basically there was a clip on Twitter that went around to where she was speaking in like her interview, like confessional thing, and she was speaking, you know, like normally, like how I am, like she was just speaking in her normal pitch and tone. But when she was talking to her romantic interest, and I believe that they went on to get engaged, so her fiance, her voice was like noticeably like a higher. And so a lot of people were kind of just like, ooh, you know, that's weird. But this phenomenon of women changing their pitches also reminded me of somebody like Elizabeth Holmes, who was like the fucking Silicon Valley scammer lady. I'm sure you all know. But it made me think of somebody like her because she did the complete opposite, but that's obviously because she worked in Silicon Valley in a male-dominated tech industry. And so it made sense that she intentionally lowered her voice. But I just thought that was interesting because that was a big part of like another people's intrigue with like that whole thing blowing up, was like she lowered her voice a lot. But I don't know, it made sense. because obviously if you have a lower voice, then that means that you could be taken more seriously and not be undermined. So yeah, I thought that the studies on women's voices was really interesting, especially in relation to infantilization, because obviously when you're very young as a girl, your voice is just naturally high, and women's voices do just deepen over time, but they are just still like naturally high, obviously, for most part. But I thought that that was so wild. I don't know, I can't even put it into words, but I just wonder when that switch happened for me, because these aren't beliefs that we're born with. Like, everybody's socialized to believe a certain thing, so I just wonder when that transition happened for me and for a lot of other women as well. But I would also like to know, in reference to that study that they did, I will be intrigued to know how the results would differ had they did a study on like same-sex couples, because all of that research was on heterosexual couples. So I just wonder if it would change if somebody of the same sex were trying to romantically talk to somebody else as well. Like, is that something a woman and man thing, as far as women changing their voices and men changing their voices, or is that just a romantic thing? But now we've kind of already transitioned out of physical aesthetics, so now I want to get into the idea of behavioral infantilization. Because while aesthetics are an important part, there seems to be a certain attitude that accompanies these aesthetics that really just tie in infantilization altogether. And it really epitomizes what it means to be quote-unquote feminine. And as I was researching for this video, I realized that all of these ideas fall under the patriarchy. So that is misogyny, infantilization, sexism, and objectification as well. Like, those are all under the umbrella of the patriarchy. So they are all related and intertwined as well. So for starters, a trait that is commonly associated with infantilization is being docile, submissive, and controllable. But of course, because of the world that we live in, a majority of people find these traits appealing in women. But throughout history, women have always been infantilized, but I can't think of a more infamous and glamorized time period besides the 1950s and 60s. And I'm referring to the infantilized housewife. We can still see that women were obviously like terribly oppressed during that time period, but there seems to always be this glamorized and aspirational lens that society as a collective views that time period through. And you can see this depicted in pop culture and in the rise of the soft life movement. So usually it's either practical advice in different ways that you can improve your life and enhance your femininity if that's something that you want to do, or the other half, it's very much recycled rhetoric that is giving very much Betty Draper to me. But what I find so interesting about the 1960s housewife is that they were obviously infantilized by their husbands and society as a whole. But because of society and the time period that they were living in as well, it was almost like women were groomed to almost have a maternal figure as well, along with them being infantilized. It was very weird. It's like men infantilize the women just so men can be infantilized themselves. And so I hope that that's making sense. I'm going to try and explain it. There seems to be this line that women have to perfectly straddle, like being an over-sexualized young girl or an infantilized woman, but there isn't that much conversation surrounding the line that women have to perfectly straddle behaviorally, in reference to them being maternal figures to their kids and their husbands, while also being this infantilized adult woman as well. It's like they have to take care of everyone, but then they also have to be docile and subservient as well. But to further elaborate on this idea of women being groomed to be more maternal while also being infantilized, I want to talk about the 1960s housewife and America's obsession with breast. Yes, this is all gonna make sense. So I saw this article titled "The Colors of Perfection: The Feminine Body, Beauty Ideals, and Identity in Post-War America, 1945 through 1970. And it was by Elizabeth M. Metelsky, and it was a dissertation that she wrote for Loyola Chicago. And so she wrote that, quote, "The compression and reshaping of feminine breasts to fit a fashionable ideal is not new, but the reverence of busty women was unique to post-war America. Remarkably, Americans were highly cognizant of this obsession and its novelty. Many contemporaries attributed the preference of larger-breasted women to the infantilization of American men. But favoring women with aggressive mammary glands, it was a way to sexualize, maternalize, and minimize women's powers, in hope to shuffle American women back to the kitchen and the bedroom. Even with the popularity of flat-chested models like Twiggy or similarly small-breasted actresses like Audrey Hepburn later in the 1960s, women continued to desire larger breasts. The sustained technological advances in plastic surgery are evidence of this, but breast augmentation surgery was just one extreme example of the lengths in which women in the post-war years would go to resculpt their figures to mirror the women of Hollywood and the fashion industry deemed most beautiful and desirable. And the women that they're talking about will be somebody like Marilyn Monroe, who's obviously for that time period considered a curvy girl. But honestly, this phenomenon and this theory surrounding women's breasts and infantilization and maternalization, I thought it was so interesting, but I also thought it was like hitting the nail on the head, because this makes perfect sense, because this was after World War II, where obviously all the men were away at war, and so women had become the new head of households, and so then they were working and everything. But by the time the men came back to their families, they didn't want their women to be taking on these roles of being the head of household, because in a way they felt emasculated. But then also there was so much trauma that they endured at war, so it will make sense that they wanted somewhat of a mother-child bond, I guess. I don't even know how to I'm still trying to process and digest this. I don't even know if I have the right verbiage to use. But also, since this was after World War II and women had taken on more quote-unquote masculine roles of going to work and taking care of the home, they also gained more agency over their lives and over their bodies, which is something that up until that time period hadn't happened before. So by the time that men had came back from war, they saw that women were becoming more independent, but that was such a social threat to them because that was never an issue before. So men in a way kind of forced the women back to conform to traditional gender roles. What I find so interesting about the connection between America's obsession with breasts and men's infantilization of femininity is that men were forcing women to take on these maternal roles with still having to show up and behave and dress like infantilized versions of themselves. So in a way, society was trying to reiterate this idea that a woman's place was in the kitchen and in the bedroom. And so during that time period, women were obviously expected to take care of the home and to provide emotional support to their husbands, as well as doing whatever the husband said, but then also simultaneously they were expected to live up to this impossible, ever-changing beauty standard. The thing with America becoming more obsessed with bigger breasts is that in this article they felt that men felt drawn to bigger breasts as if they were an infant clinging to their mother. And in some examples, this craving for attachment is linked to how men felt after leaving war, because that was obviously very traumatizing. But then they also linked that to why some men felt comfortable voting for Dwight D. Eisenhower, because they saw him as a paternal figure. In some weird Freudian way, men wanted to recreate this mother-child dynamic with their wives, but they also expected them to still perform their wifely and motherly duties to themselves and to their children as well. I think what was so disheartening about this entire thing in this time period is that nobody ever considered the remote possibility that women wanted to exist solely outside of being of service to others. We want to point out that obviously this was post-World War II, so the ideal women that women were told that they should aspire to was obviously somebody like Marilyn Monroe or Jackie O. But more specifically, Marilyn Monroe had this persona of this femme fatale that kind of morphed into this dumb blonde, because the narrative was that her proportions, more specifically her larger breasts, were to blame for her low IQ. And in this dissertation, Elizabeth will go on to elaborate that, quote, with their cartoon-like proportions, sexual abandon, and childlike innocence, Sweater girls like Marilyn Monroe and her busty counterparts were Hollywood's attempt to repress the growing assertiveness of American women. Additionally, the Monroe type reaffirmed masculinity and male heterosexuality in a decade where women not only challenged gender norms, but where manliness suffered a crisis and bachelorhood had become suspect. The scholar notes that the uneasiness regarding gender and sexuality in the era, saying that men had to look and act tough and masculine, women had to appear as soft and pink as a nursery. As the average age of marriage dropped and anxieties about homosexuality elevated, busty women served the same role as men's magazines like Hugh Hefner's Playboy. It's no coincidence that the Monroe type in Playboy magazine originated in the same decade, or that Monroe was Playboy's first centerfold in December 1953. This masculine desire for extreme femininity explains Hollywood's decisions to promote the busty actresses, because the Hollywood production code forbade exposing more than a few centimeters of visible cleavage. The studios, in an effort to outdo each other, encouraged their starlets to use padded bras and to strive for sheer size. Even Monroe, who appeared to be quote-unquote all-natural, repeatedly wore breast padding when in bathing suits or strapless gowns designed to compress the bust. And this padding that they're referring to is the bullet bra, I think that's what it's called, like the torpedo bra that make it looks like pointy, which is obviously a staple in women's fashion during that time period. And I think what's so interesting about infantilization is that the sole purpose of infantilization in any situation is to reaffirm men that they are in a position of power. And I think what's so unfortunate is that even with cultural icons like Marilyn Monroe, who was obviously a very talented actress, but due to her gender and her body type, she was only allowed to show up in the world as one way, which was the dumb blonde, because that was the most non-threatening way to the male species at that time. But since we're discussing the 50s and the 60s, I feel like we can't not discuss Mad Men. So I wanted to take a look at 3 of the female lead characters because in my opinion, they all represent different infantilized women. So the first character that I want to look at is Betty Draper, who obviously was like the most hated character on TV when this show was airing. Which, I mean, we're going to explore, but Betty had a very glamorized yet girly aesthetic. But Betty was very repressed, and she obviously had a lot of repressed anger and resentment and shame, and that peeked out like literally every episode. She was a very rigid individual, especially when it came to how she viewed femininity and how she wanted her daughter Sally to view femininity. But if you've seen Mad Men, then it's no shocker to know that Betty was like the most hated character of the entire series. And I think that it's just a disservice just to say that Betty is just a shitty person and just that be it, because obviously she was socialized to think these things and to have these ideas, and she thought that she was doing her daughter a service by trying to pass those down. So I do think it is valid to say that she is a shitty person and a shitty mother, but I also think that she is a part of a way bigger issue that she had no control over. But I think that the interesting thing about Betty is that she was the quote-unquote perfect woman in the eyes of society. She was thin, blonde, attractive. She had the beautiful husband and the 2.5 kids and the house. And so she had everything that she was told that she should aspire and want to have. But I think that her, in a way, having this perfect cookie-cutter life, in a way, hurt her even more. And it contributed even more to her lack of growth and evolution as a character throughout the series. Obviously, Betty was socialized to think that, you know, as long as she retains her beauty and, you know, she has her kids, the house, and the husband, then everything else is going to be just fine, and that she had the perfect life. And to Betty, like, everything was just about vanity. But it's like, can you really blame her, though? Because that's the only source of validation that she's ever gotten throughout her life. And I think that in a lot of ways, the societal pressure of women contributed even more to Betty's arrested development. And it didn't help that literally every man in the series literally infantilized Betty. And you can see this literally anytime whenever she has friction with another male character in the series. Like, for example, whenever, I believe it's like her and Don, her husband at the time, were hosting a dinner party or something, and his coworker Roger tries to make a move on Betty, and so Betty tells her husband Don of what Roger tried to do, and he responds by saying that she's acting like a little girl. or when Betty publicly voices her political opinions that don't necessarily align with her new husband's political opinions, he gets upset with her and tells her that she should be more concerned with getting the breadcrumbs out of the butter and not having a political opinion. Like, so it was little things like that throughout the series which really emphasized people's attitude towards Betty and this woman at the time and how they viewed her. And it's painfully obvious that a character like Betty wasn't supposed to be a mother or a housewife, but she really didn't have any other option due to the time period that she was living. And I think what was so like unfortunate about her character is that the series we get to see that times were changing and that women were becoming more progressive, but because she took so long to catch up and because she was so stuck in her ways, she kind of missed her mark. She in a way remained the same until her beliefs killed her, because if you, well, spoiler, but if you watch the series, you know that she ended up getting cancer in the later seasons, and she chose to not seek treatment because she said that she'd rather die with her beauty than to see her looks fade. So yeah, I don't think it's fair to just hate Betty because she obviously wasn't that likable of a character, but she was a victim of the patriarchy just like all the other women were. But now I want to move on to Joan, which was my fave, because Joan, she had a nice evolution. Anyways, let's move on to Joan. So Joan, she had a very over-sexualized, but she had very girlish, like almost porcelain doll features in her face. But obviously she was a very curvy woman, and she kind of had a Marilyn Monroe-esque body type. And so that really did dictate how she navigated throughout the world and how she was perceived in the workplace as well. We get to see Joan's evolution into her becoming a wife and then eventually an ex-wife, and just the entire breakdown of her marriage, which was really interesting. But she was a very interesting character overall because Joan's body type obviously really influenced her entire life. But Joan was aware of this and how she was being perceived, and so she used that to her advantage so that she could, in a way, climb the social hierarchy in the workplace. And in the earlier seasons, Joan made it abundantly clear that she aspired to be married and to trade her corporate life for a domestic one, no matter what. Like, they just seemed like being married and becoming a housewife was Joan's end game at the beginning of the series. So when she met her husband, she was really excited to enter in this new chapter of her life, but then she was obviously greatly disappointed when she realized that obviously being a housewife and a mother isn't fully fulfilling for her, but then also realizing that how much of her wanting to hang on to her keeping a job and, you know, just doing what she wanted to do and what brought her joy and happiness, in a way, her husband felt emasculated by that, and that really manifested in their relationship. And also Joan began to realize that her having a quote-unquote happy marriage depended heavily on her being subservient to her husband. But this kind of misogyny wasn't reserved for just her home life. You can see this at work as well. Joan is constantly sexually harassed by her other co-workers or the clients as well, and it's very normalized where nobody really questions it anymore. And what's so interesting about Joan is that she's sexually harassed by literally everyone throughout the entire show, but throughout the show we see that she climbs the corporate ladder. Like, she starts off as office manager, which is already a higher position, and she eventually ends the show as a partner, but throughout all of that she still a certain level of respect that she just isn't given. What was so interesting about Joan's transition into being a housewife and then her transition out of that was that seeing how jarring it was for her, I guess, the expectations versus the reality of what it actually means to be a housewife in that time period. And so she began to understand that her husband didn't really see her as a person with any autonomy, and that he didn't really see her outside of someone whose sole purpose was to stroke his ego. You can see this even when her husband is trying to force her to choose between her job and him, because obviously he's going off to war and he wants her to be the stay-at-home wife, but number one, they honestly can't really afford to because she makes more money, so obviously they kind of need the job, but he's just not with it at all. And it was like her husband went to great lengths to reassert his dominance because he felt so emasculated. Because you can see this in a lot of different ways. Obviously he R-words her in the series, and then he also, like, when they are having consensual sex, he won't let her get on top. Yeah, I think that Joan's evolution was really interesting because she was obviously still infantilized by a lot of men around her and objectified and over-sexualized. Because Joan did have a certain body type, men did not see her anything outside of being a sexual object. So even though she was more than qualified for many projects and positions, she had to really go out of her way to prove herself in comparison to her male counterparts. And in an article with The Atlantic, when talking about Mad Men, Sandy Doyle goes on to write that, quote, "But our inability to identify misogyny, even on a show that presents it so melodramatically, points to the truth behind sexism and oppression at large. To people who actually lived through the 1960s, the sexism of their culture didn't seem dramatic. The men who objectified and infantilized women were probably bore no specific malice. And the vast majority of women who found their lives constrained by those men didn't imagine that things could be different. Their oppression was invisible because it was normal. In other words, they were like us. Sexism is still around, and in the vast majority of instances, it doesn't present itself as some pretentious, shocking occurrence. It's just the fabric of everyday, daily life. A little ugliness that we take for granted," end quote. Because of course all women have had to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace on that show, but for Joan it was just on a different level, and it was just so normalized that even other women sometimes would in a way perpetuate it and think that she was in a way asking for other people to harass her. But I will say at the end, it was really nice to see Joan's evolution and her audacity to live a life that was outside of the norm and to choose to be a single mother. And lastly, I want to briefly touch on Peggy Olson. Peggy came on the series as a new girl in the first season, and she was obviously an adult woman, but she had a very girlish aesthetic. Like, she wore fringe bangs with ponytails with bows, long skirts, frilly socks, but with her it was like in a way she was doing that to like desexualize herself to fend off possible sexual harassment, which it really didn't do much because all the women in the office were sexually harassed. Obviously Peggy was very smart, but she always advocated for herself, and she just didn't accept people treating her any type of way, which a lot of the other women on that show in a way did, because they didn't really know a life outside of that. But I do think that it was still sad that even though she did all of that extra work of trying to desexualize herself and to avoid sexual harassment and objectification, she still ended up having to endure the predatory behavior from somebody like Pete Campbell. Just to wrap it all up for Mad Men, all three of these women had very different approaches to their femininity, and that still didn't stop them from being infantilized by other men in their lives and being crushed under the heavy weight of misogyny. So now I want to briefly touch on the commodification of infantilization, because infantilization in women is obviously normalized, but it's normalized because also it's profitable. And you can see this in the beauty industry with filters on social media apps and on TikTok. And we already discussed earlier on how the anti-aging industry is partially rooted in infantilizing femininity. But now let's talk about social media. So as I was researching for this video, I came across a few creators on TikTok. I'm not going to say any of their names because I don't want anybody catching any strays. But a lot of them have amassed huge followings. I'm talking about like 50 million plus followers of them in a way infantilizing oneself. And I do want to just say that there's nothing wrong with showcasing a unconventional relationship or a kink that you might have, but I do think it is somewhat inappropriate to do that on an app like TikTok, which is obviously originally made for children, but obviously it's been hijacked by adults. Even though with an app like TikTok there is an age restriction to where you have to be like 13 years or up to use the app, that is obviously easy to bypass. And I don't know, I think that some kinks are kinks because they're taboos, so I don't think that it's I don't even want to say appropriate, but I think it can be a slippery slope for it to make it into mainstream media, because obviously, like, if I see something, I can choose to either watch it or to keep on scrolling. But if there are all of these images of infantilized women, whether it be like just societal pressures and just how it's internalized, or whether it be in a more extreme case like a kink or something, a young impressionable teenager could see that and think that that is what femininity is, and think that that's something to aspire to, because they see like a lot of those creators on those platforms end up like making a lot of money, and they end up like basically changing their lives off of it. Well, with kinks in general, there needs to be consenting adults, as far as two consenting adults who are choosing to, you know, engage in the kink, but then also a consenting adult who is choosing to engage with that content as well. And I do also want to point out that different creators on TikTok, especially ones who can be perceived as infantilizing oneself for content, are usually a part of some communities that may just have qualities that could be perceived as self-infantilizing, like kawaii culture, for example. So I do want to put that out there, because I understand that conversation can be a slippery slope, and I'm not a part of these communities, so I wouldn't be comfortable having a full opinion on it, on whether it's good or bad, because there is a lot of conversation surrounding a creator like Bella Porch, but I feel like it's tricky to say if she's infantilizing herself, or maybe she's just taking up space in a certain culture. So I do think sometimes it can be a slippery slope to try and morally condemn someone for self-infantilization, because I mean, sometimes you just have to call a spade, but then other times that could have more so to do with how you view women, and less to do with how that person is choosing to show up in the world. But moving along, since we're on the topic of social media and commodification, I want to touch on beauty filters, because to my knowledge, the first beauty filter was made on Snapchat in like 2015, with like the rainbow eyes, like the dog ears and all of that. And that really, I mean, Snapchat was already popping, but beauty filters kind of ushered in a new age of social media, and they are obviously really profitable for these apps because literally everybody uses them. They help literally grow the entire popularity of so many apps, with Instagram, Facetune, and with Snapchat, for example. And there's obviously a direct link between beauty filters and facial dysmorphia, because they're promoting only one standard of beauty. But in an op-ed with the Mount Holyoke News, Kaveri Pillai wrote that, quote, "By marketing these specific facial features as ones that personify beauty, the commodification of biological characteristics inevitably produces issues of self-esteem and low confidence in young girls. The oppressive nature of Western standards of beauty are reminiscent of the obsession colonizers had with the curtailing native culture and anything that appeared to be tangential to their set normative expectations. Power shapes the gendered notion of beauty as well. The filter affects the freakishly poreless cheeks, over-the-top doe eyes, and women that look like caricatures of young, unadulterated purity. The constant need to infantilize women echoes the sentiment that with those who find it imperative to diminish women as subordinates. By equating this quote-unquote childish beauty to the facade of naive, weak, and immature, women being accepted and appreciated, the system succeeds at reifying the idea of perfect women being treated like infants. The quote-unquote young girl filter robs women of adulthood and diminishes them to a social group that is stagnant to the race of growth, once again leaving a vulnerable and marginalized group of people behind when it comes to creating a universal set of expectations." And so it's kind of like this catch-22, because people shouldn't be building careers off of infantilizing oneself, but then it's also strange that these industries profit from infantilization, and it isn't going to go anywhere because everybody isn't going to stop using filters tomorrow. But then it's like, well, dang, like, who is it to blame? Is it the patriarchy? Is it capitalism? Is it the consumers? Like, who is it? I guess it's everybody. I don't know. Yeah, I just wanted to conclude and say infantilization is bad, and it's getting weird, and it's a little too normalized. So I think that at the very least, everybody, no matter your gender, we should all question our intentions whenever we're doing something. Just think a little longer on why we do certain things, why we behave certain ways, or don't. I mean, you know, I'm probably not gonna stop wearing blush, but yeah, don't be weird. So yeah, that's that on that. I'm really tired. It's 5:42 in the morning, but yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. I'm so happy to be back on this platform, and I can't wait for you guys to see the new content that I've been working on. But yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. Be sure to check out my clothing brand Main Character The Label and my makeup brand Box Office Beauty. And yeah, I hope you guys feel safe and seen wherever you are, and I hope you guys are finding joy and fulfillment on your journey of self-expression. Until next time.